Delay, but we are ready to go with another Manchester Memories. And today we're very honored to have Shawn Harrington with us. Shawn is the curator of the Manchester Historical Society, as I'm sure you know, and he actually was the recipient of the 2015 Manchester and the Mountains Community Service Award. The Historical Society has been in existence since 1897, which I didn't know and I find fascinating. And its mission is to collect, preserve, interpret, and present the story of the town of Manchester. As always, we are filming, and this filming will be stored in Manchester Historic Society's library. So please welcome Shawn. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Sorry I'm late. It was a miscue on my part, but so when I was asked to Manchester Memories, I kind of looked at it a little bit funny because I said, well, you know, my memories don't really go back all that far, and probably most of the people who presented have forgotten more than I've actually experienced. So what we're going to talk about is a little bit more about maybe memories of early Manchester. And so this presentation I'm put together, a little interactive, will just kind of touch on some general topics, really topics that have always interested me, and when I've talked about them, other people seem to be interested as well. So the cover story really kind of tells the story of the two Manchesters. The Manchester Village, the painting on the left is a partial view of Luigi Lucioni's 1939 view of Manchester. It was the first painting he did when he actually came to Manchester. He moved here after spending a lot of time up in northern Vermont in the Shelburne area. And then on the right-hand side, what we see is we see an 1885 view from, it was called Wilson's Hill at the top. It's the hill that's behind the car dealership. Looking back towards, you can see the Baptist Church, and I'm going to see if my laser pointer won't work on the television screen, but a little square top building, a little flat top building here is the North Shore Bookstore. So Manchester really does, I mean, the story really begins in the Revolution. I mean, it was chartered in 1761. It wasn't until about 1764 that people actually started coming here. They started laying out the first road. Samuel Rose built the first log cabin. And by 1769, Samuel Rose also built the first framed structure. And about a year or so later, early 1770, 71, William Marsh built his tavern on Main Street. And the tavern was built just about where the south part of the Equinox is today. And this will all kind of tie together. The Council of Safety met here during the Revolution. That was kind of, I guess you'd say, almost a war council. Thankfully, some of the papers and some of the records have survived. They're both at the Vermont State Archives, and now and again they'll pop up in people's personal collections. We have actual Green Mountain Boys that came from Manchester, especially the Roberts family, the Fighting Roberts family. Some of them are now permanent residents at Dellwood. So if you go to Dellwood, this is Benjamin Roberts' headstone. He and his wife, he and his 6 sons went to Fort Ticonderoga with Ethan Allen, even though there wasn't a shot fired. His son, General Christopher Roberts, is buried just a couple plots down. His son, Martin Roberts, built the Roberts Homestead, which is at the corner of North Road and Route 7 today. You can kind of see the same architectural style as North Shore Bookstore today. And the aforementioned William Marsh. Now, William Marsh's story is kind of interesting because he was considered one of our forefathers of the town. He owned most of the land west of Main Street in the village, all the way down towards Purdyville, or the Purdy area where Ormsby Hill is, and Equinox Valley Nursery. Marsh played a kind of a pivotal part in the early part of of Manchester, the state of Vermont. He was friends with the Allens. In 1777, he turned Tory after the Battle of Saratoga. There's a wonderful book written by Mr. and Mrs. Brown, which was, I think it was about 2 years ago it was released, and I'll get you the title of that, but it's a fascinating read of why did Marsh turn Tory, and a lot of it stems back to his relationship with the Allens, and did he go over to the British side to help preserve Vermont, because all during the Revolution, you have to remember, the British never really raided through Vermont. Vermont was kind of left intact, and we didn't become a state until 1791. And part of that, there's theories out there that we didn't know which way it was going to go. And we kind of played both sides to a degree. And it's an interesting tale, but Marsh, needless to say, he did turn Tory. He did come back to the area. He lived in a farm right across the street from the Chanticleer, still there. And he was never allowed back into Manchester itself, but he lived there his whole life, and after he died, he's buried in East Dorset Cemetery. And this is his headstone. And his headstone is interesting because it's marked with two. It's marked with the UAE loyalist stamp and also a Sons of the American Revolution stamp. So if you're driving down Route 7 and you look over there, you can actually see his stone is one in the front row just as you go into East Dorset. When I mentioned his tavern was built at the southern part of the Equinox today, it was torn down at about 1813. A number of years later, it was kind of rebuilt as Vanderlip's Hotel by Martin Vanderlip was the one who built that. In the 1840s, Levi Orvis had a house, a general store, and his house was the north part, and it wasn't called the Equinox, it was just the Levi, it was just a general store. After he died, he left his property to his son Franklin, the dapper gentleman there in the center with the top hat on. Franklin opened the Equinox House in 1853. There were two very separate businesses. They changed over the years. These are the earliest kind of images we have from the 1860s of both of them that were used for advertising. The next two images down below you will see are from the 1870s, of more of the photographic. And they used to have huge flagpoles in the village. That's what this kind of structure is here to keep it from blowing over. And then you can see down below, those are pictures I took from the upstairs of the courthouse. Of course, the Equinox House was purchased. The northern part was joined with the southern part in the 1880s with a second floor story after Franklin was finally able to purchase it. The letter you see there on the bottom is actually a letter from Abraham Lincoln to Franklin Orvis in 1864. I don't know what he said in it, but his wife, as most of you probably know, came here and stayed twice. She stayed here in 1863. She came here, her military escort was General Abner Doubleday, who fascinated the visitors with stories of the Battle of Gettysburg and talked about how well the Vermont regiments had performed there. And she came back again in 1864 and had made plans to come back in 1865. And of course, we're just past the anniversary of April 15th of Lincoln being assassinated, so he never actually made it to Manchester. I often wonder what our history would look like now had Abraham Lincoln actually come to Manchester. Franklin's brother, Charles, is a name people probably know a little bit better today. Franklin died in 1900, and the Equinox House carried on under an Orvis until 1954, is when Louise Simons Orvis passed away. She was kind of the last of that direct Orvis lineage who was associated with the hotel. But Charles started his fly tackle company in 1856. He went over to England during the late 1850s, 58, 59, to learn how to make bamboo rods. He was a Democrat. His brother Franklin was a Republican. They used to have tremendous arguments. We have we have lots of pictures of Franklin, lots of pictures of Charles. We have very few pictures of the two of them together. Charles was, you can see over here on the left, pointing his finger at John Stockwell, who was a marble teamster and a very beloved. He was a taxi driver, I guess, at the end. He used to ferry people from the Equinox down to the Aquanic and deliver the mail between the villages. But you can see Charles stand there pointing his finger at him and probably having an argument with him about politics. And Charles was also the postmaster, and people called him Little Napoleon, and people used to sneak into the post office hoping that he wouldn't catch their attention so he could pontificate about whatever was bothering him at the time. And of course, fishing. You can see these couple rather large trout. The gentleman on the left is actually Charles Willard, who started the Orchard Park Hotel, which eventually became the Worthy Inn. And this gentleman is A.J. Gray, who is the son of the gentleman who owned the Equinox House, which was the successor of Vanderlip's. And they used to, this is them posing in the studio, which was right across the street from where the Worthy Inn was. It would have been sitting in Joe O'Day's office parking lot. That's where the Albert Smith studio was. And I'm sure they were probably walking on by after coming back from the Batten Kill, and Albert said, "Come on in here, I want to take your picture." Charles started his business in 1856. He moved into what was the former bank building. We had, this bank building was built in the 1860s. By the 1870s, they needed more room, and he moved in there, and he was there for a number of years until I think probably after he died in 1915, and eventually it became Foster's Remembrance Shops, and then of course a lot of people remember it as John Appleseed Bookstore. Just like a lot of the businesses, Charles Orvis, everybody knows who Charles was. It was really his daughter, Mary, and her fly tying girls that really put the C.F. Orvis company on the map. She's the one who wrote Flies and Their Uses. It was a big hit at the 1893 World's Fair. This picture I always loved, the first day of fishing, 1941, mostly because Phyllis Hurley's in it, Phyllis Dickey, or Phyllis Beatty, whom I get to see every once in a while and who is still pretty active in our community. And going back to kind of touch a little bit about the presidents, we had one sitting president that actually visited Manchester, and that was Howard Taft. He came here twice. He came here once as president in 1912 while he was, campaigning. He stayed. He gave a lecture at the music hall, very well attended. Retired to Hildene for the evening. He was actually invited to come to speak at the ceremony, which opened the center bridge by the bookstore. Mr. Shaw over there, actually the copy of the letter that he politely let Mr. Shaw know that he would not be able to attend, but thank you for the invite. He came back again in 1913 after he'd lost the presidency, and it's kind of interesting because Taft was Roosevelt's vice president, Teddy Roosevelt's, and Roosevelt didn't like how he was handling himself and decided to run against him. And he campaigned pretty vigorously, as he was known to do. He had two campaign stops in Vermont, one in Bennington and one in Rutland. And he stopped in front of and on his way up, he stopped in front of the Equinox and stood up and gave about a 20-minute speech. And from what I read in the Manchester Journal, he had a very cool reception. He was a Republican, and and the newspaper was run by D.K. Simons, who was a Democrat, so he didn't really have much to say about it. But what ended up happening was Roosevelt and Taft ran against each other, split the Republican ticket, and Woodrow Wilson won the nomination that year, or won the presidency that year. Taft and Lincoln were very good friends, and like I said, after Taft lost, he went back to Yale to become a professor, and he came here about a year later in September of 1913, and basically he spent a whole weekend playing golf at the Equinox with Lincoln. Lincoln had moved here in 1904 after Hildene was built, and he stayed here every summer until he died in 1926, and was also president of the Equinox for all those years. He was out there with his famous foursome, George Thatcher, who came from a prominent Albany family, Horace Young, and I'm drawing a blank on the last one, and Chip Stokes is probably going to hang me for that one. But the interesting story I wanted to tell you about was Jimmy Williams, who was the caddy in that picture. And Jimmy was he caddied for the foursome often, and he actually got a cramp, and he drowned in Equinox Pond in 1918. So that's a very well-known photograph that's shown around the area, but a lot of people don't know about Jimmy Williams. You know, one of the great draws to the area have always been the artists. Sarah Cleghorn in the upper left-hand side. She was a poet, a saint, and reformer. She championed for women's suffrage and for against child labor. She wrote a very famous poem that's read. It's called "The Golf Links," and it says, the golf links lie so near the mill that almost every day the laboring children can look out and see the men at play." And at the time, child labor was a lightning rod topic in U.S. politics. She was actually blacklisted to a degree for her views. She was good friends with Mr. Frost. They often would give talks at the Equinox Spa Pavilion, which is today Manchester Capitol at the corner of Seminary Avenue. It used to be over next to the old Johnny Appleseed bookstore. Walter Hard, another poet, or kind of our unofficial poet laureate. He wrote several books about the area and was also, an editor of Vermont Life magazine for a number of years. And, Luigi Lucioni, that picture was taken in 1915 of him painting, he came here in '39, bought a house over on East Manchester, and he was here. He lived here and painted it his whole life until he died. I think in 1984 is when Luigi passed away. Norman Rockwell, we're very fortunate to have a copy of, it's called War News, hanging out in the Commons with a little story of how that all came together. Of course. But I did really want to talk about Factory Point. And Factory Point was what the center was known as. Originally, when it was settled by Timothy Meade, he kind of kept all the land for himself, with the exception of the Baptist church. He spun off a little bit of room for a meeting house. But it really wasn't until after he died and Myron Clark came and opened up this large tannery, which eventually was taken over by his son and son-in-law, Mason S. Colburn and Augustus Clark, that really it became Factory Point. And by the 1880s, when the village was really trying to promote Manchester as a destination, having the next village, kind of the next ville over, being called Factory Point wasn't quite as appealing for the people they were trying to attract, and they were competing against Saratoga and Newport, and Poland Springs, Maine was another big destination back then. So they changed the name to Manchester Center, and in the 1880s, and you can kind of follow that through our postmarks of how they changed it. And originally they changed the spelling was to Center, C-E-N-T-R-E, and I think that caused a little bit of confusion, so it was changed in the 1890s to C-E-N-T-E-R. And these are the ladies who worked in the woolen mill, which is here, and they're sitting in Adams Park. You can see the Zion Church here in the back, and of course what we know is the funeral home today hasn't been built yet, which is why there's nice woods around there. But they would come up, and a lot of women and a lot of children worked in the mills in Manchester. And this really shows what up top we have in the 1880s, looking down from the hill up behind the car dealership. You can see where the car dealership is today was a large mill pond. This was the woolen mill here, which is about where the Sunoco station is, and you can see North Shore Bookstore. And then for many years after they drained the pond, it was just it was a grazing pasture. And as the tannery went away, what we know today is as the town green, there was still where the building where they used to dry the hides sat there for, I think, until 1967 is when they tore it down. There was everything from a diner to businesses to a couple apartments, and I think Jack Krieges actually lived up. He always likes to talk about living there. And the stack was about 75 feet high, and that was kind of a landmark in Manchester. And that was taken down in 1936, and extremely well built. The Dellwood Cemetery Association bought all the brick, and then when Mr. Goodell took down it tipped over and all the bricks smashed. So, needless to say, not many of the bricks made it over to Dellwood. But to tie in, we're going to come up next talking a little bit more about industry. Down here is the old Sirloin Saloon. It was known as the BB Marble Mill. But it was really marble, and the reason why I have this up here, we're going to talk a little bit about the biggest mill that we had in Manchester for quite a number of years was Fullerton's. And Fullerton's is today where the RK Miles corporate office building is, the yellow building in the parking lot. That was built in 1867 by the gentleman over there on the left named William H. Fullerton. And he came here and he set up in the depot right next to the station because he wanted the best way to get the materials that were coming off Mount Aeolus, put it there right onto the tracks. He could ship it all over the eastern seaboard. He got some of the large government contracts in the wake of the Civil War to make the headstones, up to 70,000. Where of the headstones came out of Mount Aeolus, came through his hands. One of his proudest accomplishments is the Soldiers Monument Memorial in Manchester Village. You can see he's standing by the base of it here in this picture. And when they brought that base up, it took 9 teams of horses to bring just the base. And if you ever have a chance to stop and then you walk up to that and then look down and look at how large that base is that holds that soldier's monument. I mean, we drive past it all the time, but if you really stop and take a look at just the sheer size of it, and to think it was all crafted right there in that building next to the depot train station, it's kind of fascinating. Oops, wrong direction. But marble continued. And when Orlando Norcross won the contract to build the New York Public Library, he went to Philadelphia looking for marble samples, and he saw this beautiful white marble and some of the Friedley buildings that were down there, and heard that it came from Mount Aylus in Dorset, came to Dorset looking for this marble, met Ernie West and, Spafford West, and they formed the Norcross and West Marble Company. A lot of people know where of course, the swimming quarry in South Dorset, but the mill was on Richville Road, where Earth and Sea is now. So this photograph was taken from about the roof of Grabbers. At the time, it would have been Battenkill Inn, looking back towards the village, and you can see this was taken about 1909. This one building here, which was the office, they picked it up after the mill was torn down. They picked it up. Greeley Roberts bought it, so they picked it up and they moved it directly across the street and put it back down again. Wow. And it's still there. You can see in the springtime it tends to flood. Is still painted gray. And I remember hearing the story, and then I would drive by and I would look at it from the street, and then I knew about this picture and look at it, and the configuration of the windows didn't work. And that's when I read that they actually didn't turn it back around to face the street. So if you stand in Kilburn's parking lot and look at the house, you'll see the front of the house is the back of the house. Anyway. And we did indeed, we had the connector, the Manchester, Dorset, and Granville Railroad, in order for them to bring all that marble down from South Dorset. They couldn't do it with the Teamsters alone. They couldn't keep up. So they laid a little over 5 miles of track. This is the one picture we have of number one chugging up through. He's actually getting ready to go into the Barnumville Gulf. And he just crossed Spruce Street down in the depot. Up here on the hill is Factory Point Cemetery. You can see some of the stones kind of peeking their way up there. And originally what they had wanted to do was to have the line go all the way up to Granville. It was going to be the big thing. Now, whether or not they actually truly planned to do that, I don't know. But they really wanted it to go to as far as Dorset, and that's as far as it made it. But you know, the mill ran full steam, employed hundreds of people in this area, and some of their descendants. Some of you know Lorraine Perry Harrington. You know, her grandfather came here from Quebec to work, and he ended up staying. And Lorraine was born down on Battenkill Lane, and you know, the Harringtons are still a pretty well-known group around this area. So, you know I kind of covered a lot of information, and I just want to know, did anybody have any questions up to this point, or anything that you'd like me to talk a little bit more about?
I want you to address the soldiers' monument here.